Ladies and gentlemen, 10:20, so just a little bit behind schedule, but it's okay. We've got a couple of seconds of flexibility in here. We can work it out. But our first panel discussion will be on conventional deterrence, maintaining advantage over China in conventional warfare capability. Biographies for our moderator and panelists are listed in your program. In order to get right into a healthy discussion, I'll ask our esteemed panelists to take their positions on the stage, please. And I will turn the microphone over to your moderator, Admiral Scott Swift, former Pacific Fleet Commander. Admiral?
Thanks, George. So it's all about strategy here at the War College, right? I am a graduate of the War College. In fact, I am a distinguished graduate. That's different than being a graduate that graduated with distinction. I didn't get my title until after I retired. So one of the things that you learn in the War College is about studying terrain and understanding the significance of strategic, operational, and tactical terrain. So part of my study when George called and said, hey, can you moderate this panel? Hey, Patricia. Was to take a look at who else was speaking, and I noticed that Harry was speaking. And so immediately I was concerned about all three terrains, the strategic, operational, and tactical terrain, because I've known Harry for a long time. We're both personal and professional friends. And I know enough that you never want to be the one following Harry. So I think one of the reasons that the senator is focused, obviously, we know the state that he's from. He's at the Coast Guard Academy this morning doing important things, but I suspect that he thought the last thing I want to do is to follow Harry. So I'm really surprised that he committed to the Coast Guard and not being here this morning prior to Harry speaking. There's a couple of things that Harry has done here. One is that he used the term revanchism. And I would encourage you to look up that term if you don't know what it is and compare it to revisionist approach. I think his comment was spot on with respect to Russia, and I think it also applies to China, so we need to be more thoughtful. The other thing is that one of the reasons that Harry and I are so close is that it's at great personal risk if I were to criticize Harry publicly, because you've already heard Bruni, she spoke out earlier. My wife, Trish and Bruni are great friends as well, so I'm always on thin ice if I'm going to throw some shade towards Harry. But I look at the scoreboard, and I just step into the batter box and see that I've already got 2 strikes, and I haven't seen my first pitch. So thanks for that, Harry. I was a little concerned when he was on a timeline to finish 10 minutes early, because what he was going to tell me is, hey, I finished 10 minutes early, good luck with that. Now I'd like to say that he finished actually a little bit late, so thanks for pointing out that, George. But privately, he's going to tell me it was the questions that were being asked that ran over. It wasn't my fault. So we do have a challenge in front of us. I'd like to take a moment, despite the fact that time is the stalking horse of this panel, and talk a little bit about the War College, because I think it's extremely important. The President spoke to this. Harry spoke to this. I think you're going to hear this, and certainly Chairman Bilden spoke to it. I think you're going to hear it from various speakers throughout the day. Yesterday, full disclosure, I'm an adjunct professor at the War College. I don't teach anything. I really want to continue to learn from the organization. Provosts don't hold that against me. But I spent yesterday morning with a Moz course, which is a 12-week course it's an elective course that students go through after they graduate. And I took a brief. They asked me to take a brief that they are going to give to Admiral Paparo next week in Hawaii. There's a team that's flying out there. Now, I'm pretty proud of the planners that I had working for me at Pac Fleet, largely because I inherited them from Harry. I followed Harry into that job. This was an exceptional brief that I took. These things happen on a regular basis at the War College, and I know the Pac Fleet is going to be in a better position when Admiral Paparo receives that brief from these students next week. In fact, CNO was just out here at a fleet sync with all of his fleet commanders here at the War College because of what the War College is. He's coming back at the end of this month with his senior 3 and 4 stars to have another strategic discussion with him. And I'm Provost, I mentioned this to the president, I'm going to advocate that he does take that brief. I know it'll be an early morning brief for him, but I'm hopefully he does it. The building that brief was given in is Sims Building. It's a historical building. Feel free not to correct me, Provost, on this. But I suspect it is the largest SCIF in any academic institution in the United States. It is stunning, and it's not complete yet. The wiring isn't complete. I would have been thrilled as a commander in the Navy to have been able to conduct war games in a facility that is as secure and as large as that facility. It's absolutely fantastic. You heard about the Admiral Hogg Center of Cyber. You heard the president talk about the international forum facility that she's interested in building. There's a gap between the funding that's available from the Navy and the government, and we can go into the whys behind that, but there's a lot of bills out there that the CNO has to be concerned about. That delta between what needs to be done by the War College and what can be done is risk. The foundation, the Naval War College Foundation, mitigates that risk. So thank you for being here. Your presence here today reinforces the good work that the foundation is doing under Chairman Bilden's leadership and the board and the trustees. It's critically important. So thank you for being here. And if you are interested and appreciate what is happening here today, understand that this happens throughout the year. These are the things that the foundation enables. I would encourage you to continue to support them in any way that you can. Those investments are critically important. We've got a huge challenge in front of us in the panel today. If you take a look at the title, Conventional Deterrence, Maintaining Advantage over China in Conventional Warfare, I think the panel is designed, those are kind of guardrails so that we kind of stay on the easy part of conventional deterrence. Well, nothing is easy that these panelists are going to cover today. Just the example in my mind, I'm very concerned about Putin's use of tactical nukes to deter conventional capability. I mean, that's essentially what his attempt in Ukraine was to do, and Harry covered that so eloquently and so well. I won't go into the detail, but Putin's threat of using tactical nukes in that theater was somewhat effective. It slowed the process down. It took a long time to get HIMARS into Ukraine. It took a while to get Javelin into Ukraine. It took a while to get Stingers into Ukraine, because understanding that line between deterrence, you know, what is too much and what is not enough, is a very difficult task, and that's the task ahead of us today. I'm not going to go through the process in the interest of time of introducing all the panelists by their bios. As George pointed out, time is of the essence here. I will point out that all of them are practitioners. Most of you know the Honorable Bing West from, well, his experience, but as well as the books that he's written. His books have focused on Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, the most consequential ones that I've read. He has been in all those theaters. He has gone, so this is the practitioner's perspective. He has lived with soldiers, sailors, Marines in the field to fully understand what it was that he was interested in writing about. You can look at John Cutler's bio and see that he's got 35 years of experience in the CIA. So direct practitioner's experience in this field. And then same with Frank Miller with his extensive experience in the Army and then in the intelligence field and the leadership that he's exercised there. So I'm going to throw Professor Holmes under the bus, and I hope I embarrass him with the comments that I'm about ready to make. People look at him as if he's doesn't have that experience at the tactical edge. But this is what I want to say about Jim. In uniform, I found his thinking insightful and expansive to my understanding of the naval tasks that were assigned to me in the various positions that I had of leadership in the Navy. Outside of uniform, since retiring, I found his thinking to be a useful guidepost to inform my understanding, and some of you asked him in the questions, of the challenges we face as a nation. And they are beacons to me to illuminate those areas that I don't have insights into, that I haven't thought deeply enough about it. So let's get to it. What we're going to do in the time that we have left, each one of the panelists, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order because I can't possibly do it by experience and value to add to this discussion. Each is going to take 5 minutes to share their views on this subject in their own unique perspective and own unique way. We'll take an opportunity to, I'll take the opportunity, the moderator, to pluck some of those elements out that may be of interest to the audience. But after that 20 minutes, we may go right to Q&A. And I would ask that you continue in the same vein that you did with Admiral Harris, is make sure there's a question in there. If you want to make a statement, that's for the keynotes to make statements up here. Make sure there's a question, and please get to it in a timely manner, as Harry pointed out, so we can take as many questions as possible. So John, I'll turn the mic over to you for your opening.
Thank you, Admiral Swift. It's a pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Well, the Chinese, thanks to Speaker Pelosi, the Chinese did us a favor and showed us at least a snapshot of the state of their military modernization over the past 20 years, because it has been a long-term modernization. Dating, depending on how you want to draw it, as far back as reform and opening in the 80s, but certainly since about 1999. And we saw them do some really unprecedented things. They fired missiles into maritime and air closure areas surrounding Taiwan, the first time they've ever done that. They flew ballistic missiles directly over Taiwan, some of which landed in Japan's claimed EEZ. It's important to note, though, what they didn't do. They didn't go inside Taiwan's claimed 12-mile territorial limits. They didn't threaten Taiwan forces to shoot first. And in a way, they didn't risk war. Now, that may be reassuring that we're sitting here today and we're not worried about war on the Taiwan Strait this week or maybe this year. But they also showed that they could go very far indeed, using military intimidation, long-range fires, precision fires, and not risk conflict. The United States didn't, as we did in the mid-90s, announce deployment of carrier strike groups to Taiwan, but the Theodore Roosevelt was on station in the Philippine Sea, and the Chinese darn well knew that. But it kind of underscores some important points. This is not a crisis that, if you want to call it that, it's not a crisis that Xi Jinping sought. It's a reaction that they felt they had to deliver, both to the United States, to the region, and especially to the political leadership and people on Taiwan. It can be a stark reminder, though, when you think about, what deters China? What deters Xi Jinping? Why hasn't he already attacked Taiwan? They built this large, capable military. Why are we still talking about it? In large measure, it's because Taiwan is not an issue that keeps Xi Jinping awake at night. If you had the top 10 list of things he worries about, except for the first week of this month, episodically, he doesn't worry about Taiwan because they have built a capacity for stability, especially with their economic integration with that island, where 40% of Taiwan's trade is to the PRC, and frankly, still with the United States. We can debate whether the US should have a policy of strategic neutrality. The fact of the matter is the People's Liberation Army has always had to assume that in a conflict over Taiwan, the US military would intervene. I'd also note that the Army and the Navy and the Missile Force and Space Force that the Chinese have built is a peacetime buildup. It's a stark reminder that they spend about 1.5% of GDP on their military every year. They spend a greater share on internal security forces, which tells you something too. And yet, because of the size of their GDP, which in 2000 was 1.2 trillion and today is 18 trillion, that 1.5% buys a lot of stuff, including an ability to build more major surface combatants, submarines, and amphibious capable ships than the US is retiring in the next 2 years, as Admiral Harris said. They do that every year. So what keeps them deterred, or really what keeps them restrained, is that Taiwan remains for Xi Jinping, as it did for his predecessors, a crisis to be avoided rather than an opportunity to be seized. There's too much risk, even with the buildup the Chinese have conducted so far, and perhaps even through 2027, as Admiral Davidson warned. They don't know who wins. They may feel that they built enormous capacity to deter the United States and try to constrain our entry into the war. They've also noticed that with Russia's war in Ukraine, the first time since the end of the Cold War that Russia's conducting combat operations in the heartland of Europe, that in this new post-Cold War, major power conflict is back on the table, and so is the potential for nuclear escalation. And so one of the most notable things, if you look at the PLA and their move toward deterrence, both conventional and strategic, is they're building out their nuclear forces at a mammoth scale. The DOD last year announced that based on their latest intelligence, the Chinese nuclear force is going to grow fivefold between now and 2030, with most of that increase programmed by 2027. So they're going to go from, when I started at CIA, 18 ICBMs that could reach the continental United States to several hundred ICBMs that can reach the United States, all of them mobile, solid fueled, and sea or air based. So they clearly view the risk of war with the United States as significant over Taiwan as the most likely cause. They're building the capacity to deter us. But so far, I hope this holds through 2027, but they're not looking for a reason to do this. At the same time, I'd say that if Taiwan crossed China's red lines by declaring formal independence, especially if it was backed by other countries, including the United States, if the United States returned to a formal security relationship, not the advisory and arms sales relationship that we've had with Chinese knowledge and concurrence since 1982, then China would probably be undeterrable. If Taiwan announced independence tomorrow and the US backed it, if we announced a formal security relationship like we had from the 1950s up until 1979, the Chinese would consider use of force. The way that war would materialize would look different from a war that they would fight in 5 or 10 years. They would go to a state of war. It probably wouldn't involve an invasion because they haven't probably yet built that force. It would be a war of encirclement, blockade, quarantine, and attrition. Counting that the United States, one of the lessons they think they've drawn from our experience in Afghanistan and before that Vietnam, is the United States will tire of drawn out, open-ended conflicts that appear unwinnable. I think I've consumed my 5 minutes, so I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Admiral. So I thought we might flip things around and consider how China thinks about conventional deterrence vis-a-vis America. We sometimes seem to assume that we can deter an antagonist for all time if we make its leadership a believer in our power and our resolve to follow through on our threats. And so we might for a while. But dynamism pervades strategic competition. Contenders grapple constantly for strategic advantage, trying to one-up each other. The red team tries to deter us even as we try to deter the red team. So it's worth looking at deterrence through their eyes. If I'm Xi Jinping and company, how do I deter US intervention in the Taiwan Strait? Well, if I were Xi, and because I'm a strategy and policy professor, I would crack open my volume of Clausewitz. While the Prussian Grand Master was writing about open war, which is what he was interested in and what he knew, he also hands us tools for thinking about peacetime deterrence. The Chinese Communist Party leadership subscribes to his logic in part. For example, founding Chairman Mao Zedong repurposed the Clausewitzian definition, of war as a continuation of political intercourse carried out with the addition of violent means. Mao proclaimed that war is politics with bloodshed, while politics is war without bloodshed. Think about that. This all-consuming, bloody-minded outlook continues to possess party leaders to the present day. It manifests itself in China's bullying wolf warrior diplomacy, in its doctrine of 3 warfares to shape this peacetime strategic environment, in its predatory lending, and in everything else China does to bolster its standing in Asia and the world. We and our allies and our friends dream of perpetual peace. For China, war is perpetual, regardless of whether contenders are slinging gunfire or missiles at one another or not. This is what we're up against. So what does Clausewitz tell us about the mechanics of deterrence? Well, for one thing, he tells us that there are 3 ways to win a strategic competition. First, the victor can cast down its opponent and dictate terms in the ordinary sense of winning through battlefield triumph. The other two ways also apply in peacetime. The victor can put its opponent in a position where it cannot win should the competition go hot. Or it can put its opponent in a position where it either can't afford to win because it has too few resources, or it doesn't care enough about its political aims to pay the price that victory would cost. A rational opponent will stand down if it finds itself in a hopeless or unaffordable predicament. Few competitors embark on a forlorn hope, and that's what China is banking on. So how do you convince an adversary to stand down, letting you get your way without fighting? For Clausewitz, the pinnacle of statecraft is to compete rationally in an environment inimical to rationality. By that he means you should always keep what he calls the value of the political object uppermost in mind. The political object is your goal, and the value of the object is how much you want that goal. How much you want something governs how much you are prepared to pay for it. It's the same principle when you go shopping for a home or a car. In Clausewitz's lingo, the value of the object determines the magnitude and the duration of the effort that you put into obtaining it. Magnitude is the rate at which a competitor spends resources such as lives, treasure, military hardware. Duration is nothing more than how long it keeps on spending. Just as in elementary physics, multiplying the rate by the time gives you the total amount of something. In this case, it reveals the price of your political goal. Think of it as purchasing your political goal on an installment plan. But there's a corollary to this Clausewitzian function. He counsels competitors not to overspend on their goals. In fact, he warns them to get out of an enterprise if they find that the goal is no longer worth what it will cost them. The price may have gone up in terms of magnitude, duration, or both. Or it could be that the leadership has stopped caring about its political goals enough to pay the price, or has more pressing priorities to attend to. Here's the perverse thing about this. The price is not fixed. Your opponent has the option to manipulate your rational calculus of statecraft and war. Think about how Beijing can play with Washington's calculations vis-a-vis Taiwan. It can try to drive down the value of Taiwan's de facto independence to the United States, or to discredit that goal altogether by denying the government in Taipei any legitimacy. The leadership can also try to deflate the value of Taiwan, a small island, relative to other U.S. priorities, such as amiable relations with Taiwan's giant neighbor, China. Push this narrative persuasively enough, and you will discourage the American government, society, and military from paying too much to defend Taiwan, preferably nothing at all. And China will prevail. And then there's the other side of Clausewitz's ledger, namely cost. China can try to convince the United States it can't win in the Strait, or can't win at an acceptable cost. This is where military deterrence comes in the form of the People's Liberation Army anti-access and area denial weaponry and doctrine. The PLA, as is well known now, has littered Chinese coastlines with shore-based armaments such as planes and missiles and so forth that can strike out to sea in concert with the PLA Navy fleet in an effort to prevent U.S. air and naval forces from reaching the battleground before it's too late to rescue Taiwan and to do our joint forces grave harm should we try to send them to that battleground. If Beijing can convince U.S. political and military leaders that our forces can't prevail in the Strait, Washington may forego the attempt. China will have deterred us. Or if Beijing convinces Washington that the grand strategic cost is too steep, our leadership may similarly be deterred even if victory in the Strait is attainable. Think about it. If the United States standing in the world depends on command of the maritime commons, as it does, and if our sea services underwrite command of the commons, as they do, then China could do fatal damage to our superpower standing, even in a losing cause. Our leadership might balk at coming to Taiwan's aid, even if it considered the island a worthy cause, simply to preserve our status in the world. Self-interest would triumph. We would be deterred, and Clausewitzian logic would have helped China carry the day. That's why Chinese leaders no doubt take delights in the results of war games such as the one conducted recently at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, which showed that we might win in the Taiwan Strait, but only at frightful cost. Under his breath, Xi can ask President Biden and his advisors whether a small parcel of real estate like Taiwan is worth such extravagant risk and cost. Xi hopes the answer is no. And if that is the answer, then he will have deterred us from stepping in. So puzzling out how to escape this Clausewitzian trap, this Clausewitzian logic, and turn it to our own advantage is the challenge that brings this panel and this symposium together. Thank you for your attention.
So I mentioned in Jim's introduction the value that the War College brings, and one of the reasons that I've committed myself to supporting the War College in retirement is all that they did for me and helping me think about the problems that we face. And I think you've got just a taste of that in what Jim has presented. If you haven't had an opportunity to review the books that he has written, then you're doing yourself a disservice if you think that the strategic commons is the maritime commons as far as the United States are concerned. So I'll turn the microphone now over to Frank for your thoughts and comments.
Thank you, Admiral. I'm going to be less academic but much more contrarian, I believe, although less than I thought I was going to be after John's discussion. I do not believe we are, and I do not believe we ever have been deterring the Chinese at the strategic level. We have instead, through many of the actions that we've taken in the Pacific and around the world in support of international laws and norms, we've inspired them to modernize their military in ways that can only be justified to take us on directly. We've possibly delayed their operational and tactical preparations for taking Taiwan, but in many ways we've also probably accelerated their buildup of an administrative and security presence in the South China Sea. Now, they can be deterred, and they are deterred. I believe, and have for some time, though, that only the Chinese can deter themselves. Only the Chinese can control the authoritative oligarchy who rules over them by making their voices and concerns heard over just how high a price they are willing to pay for reunification of Taiwan. We should reestablish our information operations efforts used so effectively against the Soviet population to inform and influence the Chinese population to act as a governor of their own leadership's legacy ambitions. Strategic ambiguity has served us quite well in the past for high-level interactions with the Chinese leadership, but it doesn't help with operational or tactical deterrence, nor in preparing the battlefield should deterrence fail. At the tactical level, my read of history shows that, and I'm an Army guy, only boots on the ground deter an aggressor. Taking the negative side of this argument, however, nearly every war we have fought as a nation began in places where we were not. The lessons from the European and Asia-Pacific battlefields of the 20th century led us to remain in Western Europe and in Northeast Asia as hedges against further aggression in those regions. Even in Iraq and Afghanistan, which were wars of choice, required surges to regain lost ground after our early downsizing of forces left security vacuums in areas that we had left. Our show of support in Ukraine, which saw the Russian special operation or invasion come just after we withdrew our trainers, is another case in point. Ukraine's land border with NATO members has kept them going, and I hope they can for a long time, though I personally doubt they can last forever with this model of support. Taiwan, however, has no land border and therefore no strategic depth to allow supplies to flow. And so Ukraine is not the model we need to be following for Taiwan. I'd like to give a hat tip to author Alan Dowd, who wrote earlier this summer in the American Legion magazine that Berlin is the better model. When we increased our forces and flowed supplies, I'm thinking of the Berlin airlift here, nonstop at the earliest signs of Soviet aggression, had we evacuated our garrison, Berlin would certainly have fallen. Chinese aggression against Taiwan, in my opinion, is at that stage. To continue deterrence, we must step up our material support to Taiwan now, before a blockade starts, and we need to think hard about putting U.S. boots back on the ground. If we wait until conflict starts, we will have to fight our way into the theater, and we'll have signed up for a global conflict with a great power competitor, because it will spread. If we go beforehand, however, we give up ambiguity, but potentially at the cost of preventing a war. And I'll leave it for questions after that. Thank you.
George, it looks like we may have, we'll see about Bing's presentation here. about 5 minutes for Q&A. What I would recommend is that we cut into, it's dangerous once you go into the lunch hour because there's two things that are happening in the audience right now. You're either focused on filling your bellies or emptying your bladder. So the time constraint is not something that I can control up here, but I would recommend going 5 minutes over, which should give us 10 minutes for Q&A, my intent. So give me the sign when we need to shut things off. I'll run the Q&A from up here to make it expeditious, but I want to share this with you now. So as Bing's sharing his comments, you can think through some of the questions that you'd like to ask the panelists. Bing?
Well, let's get to the heart of the matter. The director of the CIA and our senior admirals say that sometime in the near future, Xi is going to attack Taiwan. So let's just take that. I'd like a show of hands from all of you about the question I'm about to pose. Supposing just before the attack or when the attack takes place, the president in the next year or two sends aid to Taiwan, absolutely, as we've done in Ukraine. But he also says U.S. forces will not engage Chinese forces. So we give aid, but we're not going to go head to head. How many of you believe that's the most likely case that will occur? Raise your hands if you believe that. May I have my first slide, please? I only have 5 slides because, and they're very short because I'm a Marine, and then there'll be a test, and if you fail, then we do a 5-mile march. Look, I'm just going to put it right to you. If the United States is not in the defense with Taiwan, of course China is going to take Taiwan. And we're finished as a Pacific power when that happens, because our bluff was called, and South Korea will cut a deal with China, and so will Japan, and China will be holding a $5 trillion sea power route of trade, and everyone will look at us and say we're the Brazil of North America. When we were called out, we chickened out, and most of you believe that's what's going to happen. Taiwan is critical to our security, and no one's making that case. But instead, may I have the next slide, please? We have a bizarre situation. You can be sitting here and you can be thinking, wait a minute, did Bing just say that? And did I really say that we wouldn't fight? Yes, you did. And then you say, well, no, that wasn't your question. Your question was, what would the president do? And why should one man, the president, make a decision for all of America for our future? Because Congress has wimped out. You know why Congress wimped out? Because under the Constitution, it is the Congress that is to declare the war, then the executive carries out the war. But Congress has been perfectly happy to say we have this thing called strategic ambiguity. We may or may not fight, but that's up to you, Mr. President. You decide, because we're not going to decide. So that's the reason we're in this problem, because everything that happens holds on one man who, in whatever he's thinking at the time he makes that decision. Next slide, please. Now, why did that happen? It's because the Congress and the American people have a low confidence in the capabilities of our military and our Navy. Look at what happened in the last 4 years. As recently as 2018, 70% of the public had high confidence in our military. Today, it's 40%. You know why? We lost Vietnam, we lost Iraq, Afghanistan was a disgrace forever. And now, instead of talking about how tough we are or something, we talk about having this war game. Next slide, please. This war game at CSIS, which is downtown Washington, that says, oh, that's too tough for us to handle if we get into a fight in Taiwan. I know the Admiral Chatfield, she did say, you know, we do war fighting, we do many other things. Look, I want to get back to war fighting for the War College. And if the War College will get back to doing some war gaming and invite everyone to it and say, all right, we're going to tangle with China over Taiwan, just like we did in the days past with the Soviet Union. When I was the director of research here back in the late 70s, early 80s, we had the concept of how are we going to fight the Soviet Union when they're going to go into Western Europe. And the dominant frame of reference was that's a land battle for those of us on the ground. No, I'm not finished. And our Navy is going to be in the mid-Atlantic protecting the sea line of communication to send stuff over like we did in World War II. And some of us said, wait a minute. We got 70 attack submarines and we have 13 carrier battle groups. Why are we on the defense? Why don't we go on the offense and take it to the Soviet Union? They want to be attacking toward West Germany? All right, what's going to happen to them? And so we held war game after war game. We invited everyone to come. We invited the Congress to come. We invited all the services to come. And we played a war game after war game called the Global War Game. And time and again, we were attacking. And it gradually changed things to the extent that then when John Lehman came in as Secretary of the Navy, Philip Bilden would have been that kind of Secretary of the Navy. He sent our carriers 1,000 miles north of England off the Kola Peninsula to demonstrate that he intended to attack. Well, holy smokes, the Soviet admirals made the mistake of going to Gorbachev in 1987 and saying to him, hey, we didn't expect this. We need a lot more money for our defense. And Gorbachev later said that was one of the reasons why he decided he couldn't compete with the United States of America. He always had this idea that it would be us on the defense, and now he was having his people say, we're going to be on the defense, not NATO. And he hadn't anticipated that because the Navy was using its flexibility. That's what I'd like to see this Naval War College do as a war college. Do the games, and then do the exercises, and begin to insert into Z's thinking, because then his admirals are going to have to say, whoa, where'd this come from? He's going to have to recognize that he's dealing with a superior power. He's dealing with the United States Navy that can win any war against China. China has no oil. It's dependent on what comes from the sea, and guess who controls the sea? We control the sea. So in summary, this is the logic. May I have the last slide, please? This is the logic that I would follow. This is the strategic clarity that the Admiral was alluding to, but he didn't come right out and say it, Admiral. You know, it was very clever because you're part diplomat and part warfighter. The problem with Marines is they forgot the diplomat part. So I put it this way. If Taiwan falls, our credibility in the Pacific is over. It's just over. It's that important. It is incumbent upon this war college, the Naval War College, to reassert the credibility of our Navy power, because by God, we are more powerful than the Chinese. Once that happens and it begins to seep into the consciousness, then the Congress will find its way to have some legislation saying, yes, we're going to defend Taiwan. We're not going to let it go out there. And that, I argue, increases deterrence, because now Z has to say, wait a minute. Now they're telling us they're not fooling around about it. They're going to be in that war, the United States, and their Navy is planning to win that war and kick my ass. And that's what I'd like to see us do. Thank you.
So George, we've gone a little bit over time, but I wanted to make sure that Bing had an opportunity to make his comment. So I would ask, who has a question for this august panel up here? Who's all the way up in the back? And if you, well, whoever gets the first microphone here, this one's fine. So
I'm ready to roll if you want to go.
All the way up in the last row there. Go ahead.
So unmentioned so far this morning is the role that Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing plays in all of this, with 90% of the semiconductor chips being manufactured. Obviously, we've gone through this supply chain. No one's got any kind of semis for cars, computers, et cetera. it sits there, and to build a new fab is like a 5-year process. So I'm just wondering, in the Navy or the military's point of view, how does that factor into this thinking? Thank you.
Anybody want to touch that?
We have a really good panel this afternoon on economics that might go there and have some good talent on it, but I'll hazard a partial answer now. Taiwan's prominence is because their TMSC in particular is an advanced producer of cutting edge semiconductors, and they do it as a foundry, meaning they're not using them internally, they're shipping them around the world, including a great many to China, but especially into cell phones. A lot of the great companies, American companies who design the technology we rely on TMSC to build cutting edge, very advanced microprocessors. So it's a supply chain criticality that adds importance to the issue of Taiwan. And I think it raises a new dimension beyond a credibility issue for the United States or even a military dimension. It means Taiwan is a core part of a very essential element of the global economy, especially high-tech innovation and trade. So I think it raises the stakes. I notice you didn't go to the next thought that some go to, which is the Chinese would invade Taiwan to gain TMSC as that vital semiconductor producer. It's hard for me to see, to stay viable in that business, you have to be willing to spend tens of billions of dollars every year. And that requires that environment on Taiwan, which is a great innovation factory. It has the talent, the dedication, and the material to build a company like TMSC. I don't think that, if the Chinese walked in, they'd be ruling over the rubble of a lot, but especially the rubble of Taiwan as a major semiconductor producer, because a lot of the talent that make all that possible would be no longer available to them.
Thanks for that question. Yes, sir.
I look at it technologically, and we have the potential in our forces to certainly take on the Chinese. But if I look at our readiness, if I look at our recruiting, I look at our training, I've seen very many manifestations in the last couple of years where we are coming up subpar. And they know that. And with that in mind, I think they may be emboldened.
Any comments or question?
Let me jump on that just a little bit because I was Army attaché in Beijing as one of my jobs, and I've looked at the same thing in terms of Chinese recruiting, Chinese training, Chinese, and I completely agree with Ambassador Harris's point that man-to-man, unit-to-unit, they cannot touch us. They have an advantage in terms of Western Pacific, perhaps because of proximity. But I don't think I would ever put or put down our recruitment and training vis-a-vis the Chinese. I don't think that's a problem at all.
Okay.
I don't see them in our league anyway. They've never gone to war. They've never gone to sea. They're going to come across 100 miles of open ocean when we have arrays such that we know the movement of every single Chinese submarine, every single surface ship. We'd have to be sending them a lot of life preservers.
So I'll exercise the prerogative of the moderator to comment on that. And throughout my career, I've been concerned about readiness of the force. That's a large part of deterrence. One of the challenges of deterrence, I'm speaking more frequently about this based on the Ukrainian example, is there's a lot of coins in the deterrence jar, and one of those coins is relevance. So to Bing's comments, the way your comments resonated with me from a deterrent perspective is the deterrent action that you're taking only has value if it's relevant to those that you're trying to deter. So if you want a sidebar discussion about FONOPs are necessary but insufficient, and we're going about it the wrong way. PRC has completely hijacked them. So I think that readiness piece is important. I think to Bing's comment, not a Marine obviously, but I'll tread some water with my Marine naval brothers here. The only thing harder than defending against an amphibious landing or an air assault is conducting one. So, and China understands this. The last point I want to make is The Chinese military, the Chinese system is based on centralization of power. They cannot delegate authority. That lost generation of World War II, they lived on the delegation of authority. They fought with the resources they had against a threat that they saw. And they weren't looking for approvals from anyone. And I can tell you from my experience throughout the Navy, that is baked into our naval culture. It's baked into the Marine culture for sure, and the Army culture as well. I would say my Air Force brothers. Okay, one more question? All right.
My question is that many wise comments have been made this morning, but how does that Naval War College really affect the policy? I mean, our first war is to affect wisdom. And so how do we actually activate these ideas in Congress and in the administrative portions of our government? Do we invite these people? Do we develop personal relationships? Do you do your virtual learning by broadcasting to Congress some symposiums like this?
Yeah, so let me do a couple of things here. Jim, I'm going to throw you under the bus. If you could address that as a professor here and what your thoughts are, and then Bing, with your experience in government, Secretary of Defense and those roles that you filled, your comments would be valued as well.
Yeah, I guess I had to speak up as the home team here. Yeah, I think in a number of ways. For one thing, you talked about raising awareness in Congress. I'm a graduate of the Fleet Seminar Program here, which is the satellite network of seminars around the United States. We run about 20 of those. And one thing we find, I now chair admissions to that program, and one thing we find is we get a lot of congressional staffers come through that, particularly down in the Washington site. So there's sort of an indirect diffusion of knowledge down to Congress via congressional staffers, which is a wonderful thing. We get it from both parties and so forth. So you have that sort of thing. Second of all, and Bing obviously is going to talk about this more because he's much closer to it. But wargaming by doing war games, we're experimenting. These are experiments to determine the limits of the possible. Vis-a-vis deterring China, fighting China, or whoever the adversary might be. So in that sense, we are letting our national leadership know what their options are, and that obviously there's a dialogue between that and policy, so that policymakers don't write checks that the military forces can't cash. And then the last one, and Admiral Swift also mentioned, is simply the network of international relationships we have. Including in this very building, the NSC wardroom. You ought to check it out. It used to be the famous gaming floor that you see from the 1920s and the 1930s when Warplane Orange was gamed out right here, setting us up to fight Japan. So again, I mean, there's sort of a mix of indirect influence via education, along with more direct influence via research and going wargaming and so forth. Thanks, sir.
The foreign policy community of the United States is very, very small. We all know each other. It's that small. It's really pretty tiny. And it can be greatly influenced one way or the other. Secretary of Defense Brown, back in the late 70s, called me into his office when I was Dean of Research here, and he said, I fundamentally disagree with your idea about the Navy should go on the offense. And the Secretary of the Navy was with me, and CNO Admiral Holloway. And I said, well, sir, what about if we do some war games? And the Secretary of Defense Brown he was a reasonable guy. He said, well, go ahead. He said, but you have to invite everybody. I said, done deal, sir. We walked out, and Admiral Holloway said, what are you thinking? I said, Admiral, do you realize that he just invited us at his expense to ask people if they want to come to Newport, Rhode Island for 3 weeks during the summer? And we ended up with over 400 from Congress, from the executive branch. We had the vice president come, we had senators come, and we had war games that were really ecumenical. And after 2 or 3 years, we were having a wash after one game, and this Air Force colonel raised his hand and he said, why do we always come here to the Naval War College? And I said, you're right. Everyone in favor of going to Montgomery, Alabama Air War College in the summer raise his or her hand. And the colonel had the good sense to say, you're right, we're coming here. So if you wanted to do it, you would, open invitation. You want to come to Newport, you're going to get oversubscribed to come to Newport, and it's a very small foreign policy community.
So let me add a couple of thoughts on that. Bing talked about the Global War Games series. We stopped doing those. We stopped doing, there's probably a 10 or 15 year hiatus that we didn't do them. So we restarted them in 2009. And I was pounding on my boss's door, the commander of 3rd Fleet, to play the role of the commander for the naval force. And I couldn't get a hold of him for like 2 days. It was, administrative requests. So finally, his chief of staff called me up and says, stop bugging the admiral trying to get on his calendar to talk to him on the phone. There's nobody else in line to go be that commander in that war game. I think, Bing, that's the point that you make. We had, not only did we stop doing wargaming, the war colleges, and it's all, I describe myself as a war fighter. I did a couple of tours in DC, but people got tired of me there, so they sent me back to the fleet. But the War College is at capacity for wargaming. That's why they got the money to build the skiff. So the Navy is making those investments with the help of the foundation. But the War College informs. I mean, we've done wargaming with over 600 participants now to that level. It's just extraordinary. The Naval War College, if you haven't heard of large-scale exercise, LSC, which is a brainchild of Admiral Davidson and now Admiral Caudle is running it out of FFC, that is a war game that is played by the principals, not role players, but by the commanders themselves of Pacific Fleet, North Fleet, which is a hat that FFC wears, and NAVUR, in a major global war fight. So it's so much takes so long to pull that together, it happens every 2 years. Now, you won't read about that in the press, because if you're reading about war games in the press and the outcome, it's an unclassified game. So you've got to play these games at a highly classified, top secret, skiff play level, which is what the War College is doing. But we do invite congressmen here. I've been asked to testify twice in front of Congress because of the experience that I've had in wargaming that Bing points out. But it's not enough. And that's what you heard the president talk about this morning. That's what you've seen Bing pound the table about. So I'll close on that. Thank you for your support. We'll be at lunch. Please pull aside for takeaways. Thanks for your patience.